Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my fourth episode in this series of comparisons between the new Sony a7R3 and then the Canon 5D Mark IV. Now, in this episode today, I'm going to take a look at some of the video performance from these two cameras. And of course, we live in a day when cameras like these are often used not just for stills and traditional photography, but are pretty heavily used for cinematography as well, and for videographers, and certainly can produce some incredible footage that we only dreamed of a few years ago. And so in both cases, both these cameras do have some assets when it comes to video capture, and so we're going to break down kind of the strengths and weaknesses of either system today and to give you a look at that. So first of all, of course, I did an episode covering the video characteristics, video qualities of the 5D Mark IV as a part of my review series when I reviewed this camera back in, I think, September of 2016. And so if you haven't already seen that episode, I'd recommend that you take a look at that. So, just to kind of sum that up, at that point, I made a statement that the video quality was actually very good out of the 5D Mark IV. And of course, the whole internet hype machine was really out of control at that point in reference to the 5D Mark IV. And so since that point, of course, there have been a number of defenders of the footage and the codec from the 5D Mark IV, and, for a variety of reasons. But for our intents and purposes here today, I want to just highlight kind of one major thing, and that is that if you want to do 4K, which, by the way, I do, everything for this channel I now do in 4K, and so if you want to do 4K, you are basically limited to the motion JPEG codec in the 5D Mark IV that comes at just one bitrate option, and that is a massive 500 megabits per second. And so it takes massive amounts of storage space to collect that footage. And then, of course, it also takes a pretty tremendous amount of computing power to work with that footage because it's massive. So just note that, for example, with A7R Mark III, you have some variety of options on how you collect your footage, but basically your top bitrate choice that you have is 100 megabits per second, which is still a lot. But just note that, for example, when I did equivalent clips here of the same thing, exact same lighting, exact same conditions with these two cameras shooting at the exact same time, that the footage coming out of the 5D Mark IV, it took up 5 times as much storage space, and the simple math that bears out here, 100 megabits per second versus 500 megabits per second. And so the footage, of course, is huge. So, for those that are kind of serious cinematographers, they're serious colorists, maybe like I've done, they have upgraded their 5D Mark IV body to Canon C-Log option, and which is a $100 option to do to the camera to give you C-Log. And so it becomes very, very capable for those that want serious footage, where they're already invested. They're going to edit that footage, and they would prefer large file sizes and large amounts of information to give them the maximum flexibility in editing. So for people like that, the 5D Mark IV is actually it's an impressive 4K camera. The problem is that those people occupy a fairly small percentage of those that are going to shoot video with cameras. And for most people, they would prefer, myself included, to have an MP4 option instead of the motion JPEG at a smaller bit rate, something more like what Sony has to offer. And so here you have two different approaches in that for those that are, really hardcore, they want maximum quality footage, they may be drawn more to the 5D Mark IV. And we've already talked about the color science of the two cameras, how that in some ways you may get easier to work with color out of the 5D Mark IV as well. And of course, with the C-Log upgrade, you get a tremendous latitude, somewhere around 14 stops of dynamic range at ISO 400. And so it's very flexible footage, but as I've said, it's massive and it's overkill for most people. It would be great if you also had an MP4 alternative. On the Sony end of things, you have some different options on the MP4 footage, but of course you don't have any kind of, massive, bitrate footage there as well. And so at the same time, however, you know, although this maxes out at 100 megabits per second, the footage, of course, looks great out of it. And I am using Sony footage almost exclusively for my channel at this point, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Right now, I'm filming on a Sony a6500 that I primarily use exactly for this. And once I have the a7R3, I'll be working that into the mix as well. So, you know, kind of two different approaches here, and so which is better really will depend on what you're trying to do with the footage. Now, on that note, both of them, of course, as I mentioned, the 5D Mark IV does have a C-Log footage. It's a paid upgrade, but you can get that option. Along with, they'll, you know, supply you a number of LUTs or lookup tables to enable you in grading that footage. On the Sony side, Sony included its S-Log3 profile on the the a7R Mark III, which is a new step for them. And so I find that, you know, the log footage out of both of them seems to be very good. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat right now. I am not a serious colorist. I don't do a whole lot of high-end grading. I don't really do cinematography. I'm not a serious videographer. I do a lot of video work as a part of this channel, but that's pretty much what I do. And so, frankly, most of the time, because of the volume of episodes I need to pump out for this channel, I stick mostly to, you know, setting up a color profile in the camera, and so that I can take in-camera footage and use that without an extra grading stage as a part of it. So again, not a professional colorist here. That being said, when I went into the various, you know, pieces of software that I have for grading footage, I didn't note a major difference between the two, particularly if you're using, you know, dedicated profiles to bring you back, you know, into a, you know, a kind of a more typical gamut range. If you're using the color lookup tables, you know, that are appropriate to the footage, I found that I was able to get somewhat similar results out of the two cameras. If you're looking for a more thorough examination of that, there are a lot of people out there that are more qualified than I. Now, Sony has a few advantages here that I do want to highlight, and one of those is on what they call S and Q, and so that's your kind of slow motion and then your fast footage as well. And so on the slow motion side, the Canon 5D Mark IV tops out at 1080p. It tops out at 60 frames per second at 1080p. If you want 120 frames per second for serious slow motion, you've got to drop to 720, and the footage is not all that fantastic. Sony allows you that 120 frames per second at 1080p, and the quality of the footage is better. So certainly a win there for Sony. Unfortunately, they both top out at 30 frames per second in 4K footage. I know that a lot of us hoped for, you know, 60 frames per second here with the a7R Mark III, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Now, there's also some options on the Sony that you don't have on the Canon when it comes to crop factor at 4K. Now, I mean, the 5D Mark IV, it will do full frame, you know, and very good quality footage at 1080, but it only offers that, you know, approximately 1.7 times crop factor when it comes to 4K collection. And so you're not really going to get a full frame look per se. In fact, the framing is fairly close, I found, to that of Sony's Super 35 in terms of the crop factor. And so as a result, with the Sony, you have an option to go for either the full frame at 4K, or you have an option to do the APS-C or the Super 35 framing, which is, you know, it's actually a little bit tighter a crop than what a Sony's 1.5 times APS-C crop factor. And so now, one thing you need to know, however, if you're coming here and you just automatically, you know, throw a lens on here right now, say I've got the 24-105 f4G OSS lens, you'll find that if you go to shoot 4K video, you're automatically in Super 35 format. And those that know better than I say that the Super 35 format is actually the superior. There's not pixel binning. It's a little bit cleaner footage, although I will say that the full frame non-crop factor footage also looks very, very good, and certainly improved over the A7R Mark II. The A6500 that I'm filming on right now, the frames per second that you choose determines whether or not you get full frame, or the regular crop factor, or Super 35. And so if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you get the larger crop factor. And if you're shooting 30 frames per second, you get Super 35 on the A6500. So I was looking for kind of a similar process here. That's not the way it works here. You've got 50 megabit and 100 megabit options, but it doesn't change crop factor. You have to go into this Super 35 setting and switch it out of auto and into manual. And then when you switch it into manual, you can turn the Super 35 crop factor off. A second advantage when it comes to that for the Sony is that when you're shooting in Super 35, it means that any crop sensor, APS-C lenses that you might have will work just fine, and in some cases are very, very good options. I've got several of the Sigma DN lenses that actually work really well on the A7R Mark III in that kind of setting. And so because Sony already has built in a crop factor and APS-C mode into this body, it's not a problem at all, of course, and it means it just extends the versatility you can have if you share lenses between, as I'm doing here, between say an A6500 and A7R Mark III. Canon, of course, prohibits that, and so although its 4K mode kind of begs for crop sensor lenses that would enable, to get a wider frame of view, for example, because they're already kind of built for that. Let me just put it this way. Canon's kind of typical zoom lenses, wide-angle zooms, are typically around a 16 to 35 millimeter focal length. Their APS-C lenses are more like 10 to 22 millimeters, or in that range, which means that if you're already employing that crop factor, 10 millimeters plus the crop factor is going to give you about a 17 millimeter, between 17 and 18 millimeter full frame equivalent. Meanwhile, that 16 millimeter lens is going to give you, more like a between 28 and 29 millimeter focal length. And so obviously not nearly wide enough. But unfortunately, Canon, because they have two different mounts, EF and EFS, it means you can't mount Canon's 10 to 22 millimeter on there. And so you're left, kind of bypassing that if you want to use third-party lenses. So for example, the Tamron 10 to 24 millimeter will fit on there just fine, even though it's an APS-C lens and you can use it in that application. So I think Sony has been the smarter in implementing that here, and it means that you're more likely to reach for, first-party lenses maybe than third-party lenses. The other thing, another advantage for Sony here is, of course, while it's not fully articulating, which I would prefer, the tilting screen is certainly nice for video work, and so it just means that if you're going to be filming down in this way, it gives you more options. Or maybe if you're throwing it on a gimbal and you're going down low, once again, you can tilt things out, and certainly that's useful there. Then, of course, a huge, huge advantage here for Sony is the built-in in-body image stabilization, which of course is a huge asset in getting steady video footage. Now, don't think that IBIS is going to replace using, for example, a motorized gimbal, which I've reviewed a number of them. I own a number of them. That really is going to give you your best bang for the buck, and so you can't really beat a gimbal assembly for getting smooth footage in motion in particular. But of course, you don't always have a gimbal along with you, and IBIS is certainly an advantage there. Now, I would still say at this point, certainly for general purpose use, Canon's touchscreen is much better than what Sony's. And I've already kind of highlighted how Sony has a very limited applications for its touchscreen. It is a touchscreen, but the functionality is quite limited. You can't change menu settings. There's a lot of things you can't do. There's no, touch to focus and take a picture in stills mode. In video mode, in some ways you get kind of the best performance out of the touchscreen on the Sony, in that you can touch to focus in video mode, whereas you can't in stills. And so, however, there are some downsides there. The Sony selection point, it tends to disappear on you. It can be very hard to see. It's also quite a very small box, and so it's not only hard to see, but sometimes it can be, hard to kind of touch exactly where you want, which is not necessarily a super precise process anyway. And so, that certainly is an advantage for Canon. The only downside I would say for Canon is that its touch box is fairly large, and so it might overlap if you're touching on a smaller, more precise area. There might be some overlap there. But in terms of seeing the selection point, it's much clearer on the Canon, and the Canon screen is more. It's more responsive to touch, and sometimes you can touch on the Sony screen and it doesn't move, quite as you would like, or you have to tap maybe a couple times in some instances. But certainly it's not terrible at the same time. Now, both of these cameras will give you options for the behavior of the autofocus during video server AF. And so you can change kind of the speed in which it will make changes. And so Sony gives you 3 options. You've got a fast and a slow and a normal, basically. And that applies to how quickly it's going to make focus changes. For example, if you're selecting autofocus points on the back, but even if you're trying to track faces, it's going to change the responsiveness of how aggressively or slowly it makes focus changes. And so if you're having issues with face tracking, you might want to play around with those settings and see if there's a mode that works better for your application than others. Canon has a slightly wider range of options on all of these kind of features sets, in that Sony has 3 or in some cases 2 options. The Canon will have typically around 5 options there as well. Now, in terms of the actual performance while tracking faces, I still haven't seen anything that tops Canon's DP-AF. It is fantastic, almost magical for tracking face movements and keeping everything in focus in a very smooth fashion without, kind of hunting or focus pulls back and forth. It does an extremely good job of that. That being said, the Sony is, it's the closest application out of a Sony that I've seen so far in, maybe narrowing the gap to Canon's DP-AF. Okay, we're going to test face tracking here, and so on both cameras I've got native glass on there. I've got, in both cases, the tracking responsiveness is just at the standard setting, and then what I've done is I've allowed it to select across the whole frame and then do face tracking. And so we're going to do just a few little tests here to see how it handles, kind of some movement as a part of the process. So I'm just going to go side to side here. I'm going to come up and down a few times here just to see how it does moving that. And how about moving back and forth closer to the camera, and now at varying speeds, just to see how it handles that and how quickly it recovers from these things, how smoothly that it recovers. Finally, if I turn my face away and I look back, how about on the other side, eyes are hidden and looking back. Let's see how quickly it picks up on those. Just note that with either of these, but particularly with Sony, the closer the face is to the center of the frame, the better the performance will be. And if you get off towards the edges of, the selection box where face tracking is going to take place, if you push the margins, you will get more hunting and more misfocuses. But I would say that this is improved even over the Sony a6500 that I'm filming on right now. And one other kind of advantage that I would say that comes from having an EVF is that sometimes if you're shooting outside in bright conditions, it can be really hard on a traditional screen if you don't have some kind of loop along to review the footage and see how balanced things are. And so being able to review video footage in the viewfinder helps to eliminate, light glare and give you a truer sense of your actual footage quality. And so that's nice. So to wrap things up here, obviously both of these have strengths. Both of them can produce amazing looking footage. But if, for my purposes, which as I've said is not necessarily serious color grading, not serious cinematography type footage. It's the kind of footage that I gather for this kind of channel or as a part of doing reviews. And for what I want, the Sony approach is the better one for me. It just gives you more flexibility without, making it all or nothing. And it gives you more options in terms of bit rate. It gives you more options in terms of crop factor. It just gives you more options, period. And I think the footage that comes out of the cameras, both the A6500 and the A7R3 Mark III, is fantastic. And I get a lot of very positive feedback about the footage that I have on this channel. And so, since I've gotten the A6500, it's been the primary body that I reach for filming work. And basically, I've only reached for the 5D Mark III when I have to. And that typically means that I'm reviewing a lens on the A6500 and I need to have it in hand. But now that I'm adding the A7R Mark III, I suspect that the times that I reach for this for 4K work is going to be few and far between. And so that certainly makes this, in my mind, a pretty strong win for Sony. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll watch following along, I've got basically one final episode where I'm going to look at the autofocus and as it comes to A7R Mark III. Then I'm going to give you a final review. I also will have a final review of the 24-105 f4G lens if you want to check that out as well. And of course, in the meantime, if you'll look in the description down below or at the end of this video, I've got linkage to a whole playlist, a lot of different things that are covered as a part of this. And also there's a link there to an ongoing image gallery that I've been adding to over this last 4 or 5 weeks of review period. And so you can follow me also there on social media. You can become a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.